Having at first looked at deity worship or goddess worship in Hinduism, we're now going to consider how diaspora is shaping communities worldwide. On the left-hand side of the slide, you can see the South Asian diaspora worldwide, but we're going to focus specifically on the Tamil diaspora for a bit, because the Tamil diaspora refers to descendants of the Tamil immigrants who emigrated from their native lands or birth lands in Tamil Nadu, Pondicherry, and Sri Lanka in South Asia to other parts of the world. The Tamil diaspora is quite significant, predominantly in Malaysia, South Africa, Singapore, the Arab Gulf states of the Persian Gulf, North America, and Western Europe. Tamils have a long tradition of seafaring and a history of overseas migration to foreign lands due to close proximity to the Indian Ocean networks throughout the ancient and medieval historical epochs. Many Tamil immigrants who left the shores of Tamil Nadu before the 18th century mixed with other various ethno-linguistic groups in other regions, especially in Southeast Asia. In the medieval periods, Tamils emigrated as soldiers, traders, and laborers to settle in Kerala, especially in Palakkad, in Karnataka, in Maharashtra, in Sri Lanka, in Thailand, in Malaysia, what is now Indonesia, and intermixed with the local populations, while few communities still retained their unique language and culture. Although early emigrant groups were not as well documented as the Tamil Muslims who emigrated in later periods in considerable numbers, we do see early Hindu influence in those early emigrations. But it's important to note that Tamil Muslims were influential in considerable numbers in the Sultanate of Malacca, in what is now present-day Malaysia, as well as instrumental in spreading Islam among indigenous communities in island Southeast Asia as well. Some are descended from immigrants from the lands of Arabia and the Middle East and the Hejaz, and would consider themselves to be part of the Sayyid lineages, that is, lineages of individuals who trace themselves back to the Prophet Muhammad. This is well known across the Tamil diaspora, but you do find predominant influence of Hinduism in the diaspora as well. There are significant Hindu communities in the Tamil diaspora. For example, in the Seychelles, you have a temple pictured on the right-hand side of the slide, the Vinayakar temple, which is clearly in a Tamil style with this very large roof extending up several metaphorical stories, and very vibrant and colorful. During the colonial period, British, Dutch, French, Portuguese, and Danish colonial administrators recruited large numbers of local Tamils as they took them to overseas colonies to work as laborers, petty administration officers, and undertake clerical and military duties for the sake of colonial governance. In the 19th century in Madras Presidency or Madras Residency, of which the Tamil Nadu region was a core part of, there was also a brutal series of famines. The Great Famine of 1876 to 1878 was even made worse by the failures of British colonial administration. Tamil Nadu was both politically and economically weak during this period. Britishers, or British administrators, as you might call them, but the local term was Britishers, thus made use of hungry Tamil workers for their plantations all over the world, especially rubber plantations in Malaysia, what is now Singapore, Myanmar, Mauritius, South Africa, other plantations in Kenya, Tanzania, Fiji, and also Sri Lanka, as distinct from the Tamils who had already migrated to Sri Lanka before the 18th century. Some of the Tamil groups, especially Chettiars, Pillais, and Muslims, emigrated as commercial migrants. these groups were more likely to end up in the offices of colonial administrators, especially with Pillais and Chetiers as being perceived from the colonial administrators as being members of castes that would be particularly adept to trading and administrative work. This being said, many also left for work in the possessions of the French Empire vis-a-vis its holdings in Pondicherry, in the south and eastern region of what is now India, in Reunion, and the French Caribbean islands of Martinique and Guadeloupe. A small group of Tamils was also hired by Dutch colonial government figures in the Dutch East Indies and present-day Indonesia, especially to work on rubber plantations in Sumatra, namely outside of Medan. And you will find that there are Tamil temples, especially devoted to Sri Mariamman, in Medan, in peninsular Malaya or Malaysia now, in Singapore, as well as in Ho Chi Minh City and what was formerly Saigon in French Indochina. And there's a sort of Chetiar and Pillai network that connects these localities together. And additionally, you also find migrants who moved to Bangkok, even though Bangkok was not part of the colonial administration directly. Siam was part of the sort of influence of the British colonial sphere. Roughly about 40,000 descendants of the Tamil migrants and immigrants are still found in Medan in Indonesia on the island of Sumatra today. During and after the devastation of World War II, many Tamils and other South Asians from Burma through Pakistan fled to India, to Manipur and Tamil Nadu, and also fled from these regions as well, particularly after the partition in 1947, and then conflicts in World War II in British Burma and what became Myanmar. They established Burmese refugee colonies that still exist in Myanmar and maintain identity as Burmese returnees. And if you picked up on the narrative of the Rohingya is perhaps part of that contested history as well, we might say. In Sri Lanka, the Sinhalese nationalist SLFP party disenfranchised all Indian origin Indian Tamils in Sri Lanka and forcibly returned 600,000 to India under the Srimavo Shastri Pact signed between India and Sri Lanka. Many were repatriated to the Nilgiris region and tea estates, which were formerly tea plantations in India. They too maintained a distinct identity as Seljan returnees to Tamil Nadu. A term Black July is a term that is used to refer to another stream of Sri Lankan and Indian Tamils of Sri Lanka refugees in India who have languished for the last 20 years in refugee camps, starting during a forced migration in July, hence Black July, throughout Tamil Nadu regions, while many others also have integrated with the mainstream community or left India for other countries in Western Europe or North America, as well as the Caribbean. There is also a movement of native Sri Lankan Tamils to India today. Some migrated due to white-collar job opportunities during the British days dating back to the 19th century, but there has been a much bigger diaspora in the present. The Sri Lankan Tamil diaspora was well established in Malaysia, Singapore, and the United Kingdom prior to the 1983 Black July-induced dispersal of refugees and asylum claimants in India, Europe, and Canada. Although relatively recent in origin, this subgroup had well-established communities in their host countries prior to the 1983 pogroms that took place in Sri Lanka. In the second half of the 20th century, Tamils as well as other South Asians have migrated as skilled professionals and not so skilled professionals to various parts of other South Asian countries, but also countries like the UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, Singapore, and so forth, as part of a sort of greater Anglophone sphere of global communities of South Asians. Some of them have gotten citizenship, and a substantial number have obtained citizenship in the United States, although substantial more retain resident status, and some retain visitor status as well. Respective countries also have shifting perceptions of their immigration laws with respect to especially Tamil diasporas, depending on their recognition of Tamils as needing particular refugee status based upon the political circumstances in Tamil Nadu and Sri Lanka. For example, in the United States, the refugee status, the recognition of refugee status of Tamil populations has been significantly behind the letter of the law as required under American law. But there may be an increase in the near future of recognition of American legal patterns and legal requirements for Tamil refugees. Here in the photo, you see a Malabar temple in Reunion, and you might notice, or Reunion, and you might notice just the sort of pattern of the roofing being particularly South Asian in style. For your post, you should contribute to one of 3 threads. The first thread will be to respond to the question in discussion, how would the movement of the Tamil diaspora reshape the worship of goddesses in Hinduism? The second thread will be, how would there be blended practices with other religions? Or why might there not be blended practices with other religions in these diaspora communities? And the third thread would be, would there be the formation of new goddesses or the veneration of new goddesses in diaspora? Why or why not? So go ahead and make a quick post, and we'll keep the discussion flowing.